Bienvenidos, welcome, bem-vindo to our very first Audit, Create, Market Personal Branding Workshop Series. My name is Alex Larson, and I'm the Senior Designer at Alpha. I've been here for about 2 years. And I have been working as a professional designer for almost 10 years. But I've been doing design in some way or another since I was a teenager. I've worked as a freelance consultant with both small businesses and startups. I worked as an in-house designer in the corporate world, and now I work in nonprofit. I've designed everything from trade show booths to email signatures.
And my name is Suhaili Ramon. I'm the marketing director, and I've been with Alpha for about 2 years. Alex and I are more than excited to welcome you all to our first personal finance series that we're happy to put on behalf of the Alpha Familia. And we're hoping that this overall series starting today is going to bring you lots of knowledge, and lots of value that you can implement into your personal branding. Before we kick off, we do want to call out that personal branding as a whole is important not just for your professional presence. Personal branding can and does affect your job opportunities, your career advancement opportunities. If you are an entrepreneur, have a small business, your clients that you can attain. And so personal branding is something that even though many of us do not think about on a day-to-day basis, majority of us are making real-time decisions based on someone's personal brand. And so the topics that we're discussing today is just the audit portion of the series overall. But it's actually the toughest and the most important out of the overall series. So I'll kick it back to you, Alex.
Okay, if we can go to slide 1, my love. Okay, so this is quite possibly the hardest part. I know that it is for me when I do my own personal brand, but it's also the most important. So when you build a brand, regardless of if you're building it for an individual or for a company, you need to take in account who or what you're building the brand for. This part, asking yourself questions like, is this a professional only personal brand or is it a mix? What do you want to be known for? What do you aspire to achieve? And answering them honestly is the foundation of on which your brand is built. But don't worry too much about it. There are no wrong answers. There's only answers. But you do need to take your time as you go through this process because it's important as a good starting point for your entire brand.
And so you may be seeing this question, right? Why do an audit? And think, I don't think I need to take too much notes about myself. I have a pretty clear idea of who I am. But the reality is we are consistently growing, developing, and evolving in a very rapid manner. And so majority of us actually do not have the space or make the space in the work that we do or how we show up in the world to think about how we're showing up in the world, which is what makes this part of the series and part of the audit component extremely more difficult, right? And that's why it takes a lot more time. These 8 next considerations are just 8 of the things that Alex and I really had to go back and dig through and collaborate on as we were both taking into account our own personal brand as examples that we will be discussing in a little bit in a few more slides. But so one of them being your skills and experiences. That's more on your professional side. Your personal and professional achievements, going back to what Alex just said, right? You have to make the decision on whether your personal brand is going to be strictly professional, or is it going to be only personal, or do you want it to be a mix? And so regardless or with that answer is what you're going to decide on which personal or professional achievements you want to incorporate into your personal brand. Your values and your strengths. It's extremely important to make sure that you are taking the best part of yourself to put the best foot forward. How do you carry yourself in the workplace? But also think about how people in the workplace interact with you. I'm going to repeat this on and on throughout the presentation, but personal branding is not just something that is made up of pretty colors and a nice font. And it's not just how interact with you throughout digital platforms. And so it's extremely important for you to really think about how other people interact with you, as well as how you would like to be interacted with, which that brings you to how you communicate. A lot of people don't think about their communication style. However, how you communicate or how other people come to communicate with you is actually one of the most important components about your personal brand, right? Because through your personal brand, through how you communicate, it's typically the way how people connect with you. And so if you are a fantastic communicator, or you tend to struggle a little bit about how to communicate verbally, but you're a very strong writer, leaning into the best format for you to communicate and implementing that into your personal brand is going to be your differentiator. The way you like to network, or how Alex and I have had plenty of conversations, how you dislike how to network. Again, everything about personal branding is personal. So really take it into account, who you are instead of who you would like to be is what's going to set you up for success. And so how you like to network, what are the spaces, for what reason you would like to network is this extremely important part of your personal brand. How your target audience connects with you. Again, as I just mentioned, how people connect with you, how people network with you, how you communicate with other people. These are all ways that's going to help your community or your audience connect with you in a very authentic way. And last but definitely not least, and this is something that I'm also going to be speaking about when I talk about my own personal branding, but your interests, hobbies, and more, or lack of thereof, which is a little bit more where I fall on the side. This is actually a part that most people don't really take into account is their interest in their hobbies, is really thinking about who are they outside of the workplace. This may sound pretty funny, but majority of us, myself included, may come to realize that all they know about themselves, or they've built an entire identity around their work. And maybe that's who you need to be when you're an early professional. But as you grow and you become a more seasoned professional, you may want to be able to actually showcase the things that you are doing outside of the workplace, right? Or that align with your workplace, but want to show more of that complexity of who you are through your overall identity. So all of these 8 are just considerations that you can and should be taken into account when thinking about your personal brand.
Okay, so we've made available to you all a personal branding workbook to help you on your journey through this brand development process. We are focusing in the audit section on sections 1 and 2 of the workbook, and you can download the workbook here. If we can go to the next slide.
Yep.
Just scan the QR code and just make sure that you type in the right password. It should be all caps to be able to reach the download link. The questions in this workbook are there to help you think your way through the brand development process. Please take your time. There is no test at the end. No one's going to quiz you on what did you put for answer number 6 on page 10. There's none of that. This is all at your own pace entirely. And it's okay and actually really encouraged for you to talk to friends, to family, trusted colleagues, a mentor if you have one, to ask them for help, to ask them for feedback, to ask them to collaborate with you on some of these answers, because they are very introspective and they do require you to think a lot about yourself and what you've done in your life. So make sure to ask for help when you are struggling.
So looking into the next portion of this audit series, and we know that a lot of the things that we're talking about really feels very theoretical and it feels very outside of who we are, right? Because a lot of the times, again, we don't make the time or the space to think about ourselves in such a in-depth manner. As I mentioned before, developing your personal brand is a personal process because your personal brand should be personal. However, this is not a process that you do by yourself. As Alex mentioned, you need to go into your community. You need to turn to your family, to your kids, your spouse, your husband. You need to go and talk to your colleagues. You spend most of your time at work. more likely than not, these people know you the best when it comes to your workplace persona, or just who you are in the workplace. And so having those conversations, having the time and taking the time to really think about, how do other people perceive you? How do other people perceive the space that you take up in a room? Those are all crucial pieces of information that cannot be rushed, which is why we wanted to make, and we created that workbook to allow you to go through it and take time and space away from it and come back with a lot more clarity. As Alex mentioned before, there are truly no wrong answers. There are just answers that's going to help you create your own path and being able to help you build your own personal brand.
Yes. Okay, so we have an example. So this is a client I worked with on their personal brand recently. They're almost 60, and the brand that they currently use doesn't serve them in a way that they need it to anymore. So what's changed for them is they're now starting to truly think about retirement and what retirement is going to look like for them. And their values have slightly shifted as well. So values like family and kindness and accountability have shifted to be more prominent versus things that they were in the past. So for this particular person, their pain point while going through the audit process has to do with questions that are in section 2 of our workbook, but have to do with the articulation of his purpose and what his aspirations were, where he wanted to go. So just be aware that there's going to be points in the process that are going to be difficult, and they'll be different for everybody. Some people might find this part of the process of defining and articulating their purpose super easy, and might find it really, really difficult when they get to our second series where they have to actually create something and do something creative. That might be their pain point. For this particular person, their pain point was on this articulation process. But he ended up asking family members and his wife to kind of help him think through it. And we did skip that question and move on to other things to kind of and it ended up being that answering questions after that helped him be able to answer that original question. So don't think you have to do this all 1, 2, 3, 4. You're allowed to skip and move around. And sometimes that helps you in the process. And so you will begin to notice as you do this patterns. And by patterns, I mean things like if you look at person A's strengths and weaknesses, some of them are two sides of the same coin. Like being detail-oriented can also mean being a perfectionist, or being very disciplined can mean being very inflexible. So noticing those patterns is an important thing to do during this process, and just kind of make a note of it in your head. But other patterns we recognize were that he is a safety professional, and he really didn't know or didn't realize that he really cared about making the world safer and making things be less risk, mitigating risk, which is his job, but also something he realized that he did in his free time by being a volunteer firefighter. He also realized that giving back to communities was also very important for him, being the firefighter, and also he's on a volunteer board position with a safety professional nonprofit. So those things are things that he didn't realize were a pattern until he wrote it all down. So sometimes you have this underlying connection that you just have never really put a name to, that doing this process allows you to name, to kind of be like, oh, I didn't realize that this is something I really, truly cared about. And it showed up in so many different spots in answering these questions. There is a spot in section 2, there's a space to recognize these patterns and write them all down. And it's important you do so, because this plays into how you show up in different areas in the brand development process. So go ahead.
Oh, no, I was about to say, what I really love about this example is when we go back to, I believe it was section 2 of our presentation, of those considerations. Like, I love how you were able to really connect the dots between not just his day job, but also the fact, right, where he was volunteering, what was he doing, and how all of these things, as you mentioned, like there was a theme that just didn't have a name to it. And that ended up being the core foundation of his personal brand.
Yes. And that's a thing that a lot of people, as you've said multiple times already, that we're missing labeling it. It's not because we're not doing it. It's just because we're not necessarily taking the time to sit down and think about it all the way through and have that moment when you're like, oh, this is really important to me. And I didn't even realize how important it was to me, but I do it in 4 different places. So it could be something as you really like art. In his case, it was he wanted to make people feel safer. In other people's case, it might be I really like writing and I write for my job and I write on the side and I write in my journal and at home. There could be a whole host of things that you're just missing because in your brain, it's just not connected in any way.
Right.
But when you write it all down, you kind of realize, oh, they are really connected. And this could be the foundation of who I am as a person, or even your foundation of your personal brand.
So this brings us to defining your relationship. And what we mean by that is truly defining the relationship that you have with yourself. So the personal brand truly is the version of who you are at this moment and who you want to be. But majority of us either A, don't have the clarity of who we want to be, but we know who we are right now and how, in what ways do we want to truly develop this version of ourselves, right? And so both sides are true and both sides are just as important. Again, it's really being able to decipher for yourself, which one am I? Do I already have a very clear vision for who I want to be in the next 5 to 10 years or just in the future? Or if I'm not that person who has that clear vision, then who do I want to be right now, or who am I right now? And how can I make sure that I'm creating a very strong personal brand based on who I am?
Exactly. So, for full disclosure, I struggle answering questions about purpose and aspiration, particularly right where I am in my life right now. So, currently, my answers to those questions and subsequently my brand are very immediate. It's about a lot about who I am right now. The purpose of my brand is less to drive me somewhere like a car and more a very well decorated room that I'm currently in. So my brand's purpose is to give cohesion to my LinkedIn, to different platforms, and my online portfolio for my design work. Its job is to act as an engaging but accurate representation of both myself and my design styles, but also to just give a good representation of who I am right now and what I am doing right now. Its goal is not to get me to a specific place. It's to highlight who I am at this current moment.
And on my side, I'm on the other end of the fence where I actually always had a very clear idea of who I wanted to become and still now where I want to be. Just for a little bit more transparency, I've always said that I wanted to be a thought leader in multicultural marketing, specifically or focusing on the Latino community. And so everything that I do and the way that I show up on across digital platforms, the way that I create content, that I write content, the way that I network, the way that I communicate, it's all really focused on multicultural marketing. And everything is specifically focused on the Latino community because that is a community that I am extremely, I've always been very interested and very passionate about the representation of Latinos. And I've always known that I wanted my both professional and my personal work and branding to be aligned with that passion. And so I always had that very clear idea. And it was interesting because as Alex and I've been working through our own personal brand and building our websites and putting all these things together that we're now bringing to you through this series, we had to kind of go back and look through a lot of like old items, right? Like you were talking about how much you have grown in the last few years and how proud it makes you feel of who you are today. And for me, it was going back through old journals, seeing the things that I was writing, the things that I was trying to manifest or vision for myself, my college essays, and just realizing how the idea or the vision that I had for myself has not changed in the last 15 years. And it most likely will not. How I decide to lean into that with my personal brand obviously does have a lot of flexibility, which is great, right? You want your personal branding to be flexible, to allow yourself to grow and evolve. But however, that theme, that core mission for how I want to show up in the world has not changed. And example, person A, which Alex is going to go through, is an example of a little bit of both.
Yes. So the person A that we met in our previous example, he is in this transitional period where he right now works in a senior level position. He's a senior executive at a corporate job, but he's kind of in this transitional period of where he wants to be is working as a consultant during his retirement for himself. So that's kind of where he is. And so just if I am a well-decorated room and Zuhaili is a train on a set path to her destination, this person is more of a bridge. They're most likely leaving one personal brand that he has right now to create a new personal brand that is going to get him to where he wants to be as a consultant working for himself. And then it will most likely change again, or at least shift to be something a little bit more solid in that consultant space. So so you can kind of follow this. So it's the bridge to your new position essentially. So in his case, its transitional period is going from being a full-time worker to being someone who is retired. But you might relate to this in the sense of going from a student to a professional, or from a young adult to a not young adult, into a more adults. But those sort of shifts in thought process and thinking is what kind of gives you these things. Or if you're shifting entire careers or industries, you might find yourself in this position of being like, I've worked in this industry for so long and I want to shift over to this industry, but my current brand doesn't help me there. I need to make this shift, and then I can fully become someone who exists in a new industry. And we will ask you, part of this process, we'll ask you a lot of these questions. And depending on what you're doing in each section and what you want out of your brand will depend on what type of branding you're going to create. So Zuhaili has her end goal that she's reaching for, and her brand is very clear on that as her goal and her purpose. My brand is a lot more simple in the sense of it doesn't really have a goal point. It's more of an indication of who I am right now at this moment. And that's totally okay. It's my brand. And yes, could I have created a brand to get me to a specific goal point? I could have, but it would have felt inauthentic because that's not necessarily where I want to go. There's so many different ways I could have gone, and I wasn't really sure where I wanted to be, that it seemed counterproductive to create something that I might have to change if my goals changed or shift. So creating something for myself right now that were based off of less my end goal and more myself as a human being and a person and a designer was a more authentic and reasonable choice for my brand development. So in the workbook, we do ask you a simple question in section 2, or maybe not so simple, depends. And the question is, what are the first 3 words that you want someone to think of when they think of you? Mm-hmm. And mine were creative, energetic, and passionate. And hopefully my current personal brand embodies that. It's very colorful. It has a lot of touch points from my culture, from Brazil, from my mom, and it's got a lot of just my own personal art style built in. I like a lot of color, as you can see by my very colorful dress. But there's a lot of myself in this brand.
Right.
But you'll also notice that the words that I chose that I want people to think of for myself are words that I already embody. They're words that I already exist within and people have already attributed to me. They're not words that I would have to strive to reach. Mm-hmm. So you'll notice I did not say organized. While I would love for the world to think that I am organized, It will never happen. I'm not organized. And if I had said organized in that little list, I would just be setting myself up to be deeply, deeply frustrated with the sole purpose of never being able to live up to that word
Right.
because I'm not. I am creative, but I'm not organized.
Right.
So trying to fit yourself into a box that you think you should be within this brand isn't going to help you. So I could have created a brand for myself that follows along Zuhaili's path of trying to get myself to a specific point or job or career, but it would have been very, very difficult for me to keep up with it and uphold it. The same way that Zuhaili would probably feel if she created a brand along my thing of a nice, well-decorated room. She would feel very trapped or stagnant in there because it's not getting her where she needs to go. So you need to kind of separate yourself from what you think you should be doing or what the world wants you to be doing. And you really need to take a good hard look at what you actually want and what you actually want to be doing and want to go. Because a brand will always feel inauthentic if you are trying so hard to be something that you just aren't. And sometimes it's a little bit of fake it till you make it, but there's no faking or making that will make anyone think I'm an organized person. So like I don't want to set myself up to be that frustrated with both myself and potentially having clients frustrated with me because they can come and say, "Well, I thought you were so organized." And then it turns out you're really not, and you're just not living up to your expectations or theirs. So there's a very fine line of being able to fake it till you make it, but also being actually true and honest with who you are and what you can come up with. So this bridging part that person A is looking for, they're being true to themselves in the sense of, I know I need to get to this point, but from that point, I don't know where I'm going yet. So it doesn't make sense to do that 10 years in advance of, I've been retired for 5 years and I know what I'm doing and this is what my life looks like. It makes more sense for them to be like, I want to be at that starting post. So they are running a pre-race to get themselves to that very beginning point so then they can readjust and adapt their brand from there. So it all depends on where you are and where you're going and making sure that you're being true and honest with what you actually want out of your brand and your life, I guess.
Yeah. No, because the reality is, right, as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, your personal brand is something that can most definitely work for you, but if built in an inauthentic way, it will be something that works against you. And so you can literally get job opportunities, professional advancement, clients. The opportunities truly are endless when you are connecting in a way that seems very seamless to you, right? That it's just easy, it flows. People that know you say, wow, that is literally
You
are correct. And that is the emotion that you're trying to emit, right? We all have things that we wish we were. And while we are working towards those things, perhaps those are not the things that we want to say we are at this moment because we're not yet. And so really having that honest conversation with yourself is going to be crucial to making sure that you're setting setting a foundation up for success, rather than with the idea of, well, I will be this person at one given point. Because at that point, you're going to be competing with a version of yourself that you are not yet.
Yeah.
And that makes personal branding even more difficult than it has to be.
Yeah. So exactly. And also who you are now and what currently is infinitely more important than anything that you should be.
Mm-hmm.
Like who you are embodying now and where you are on your own journey and path to wherever you want to be going is more important than any hypothetical that might happen. So take care of the person you are now. Don't just ignore them for this imaginary person you want to be in the future that you haven't reached yet. It's fine to have that as an aspiration, and that's the end point of your personal brand, and that's the job your personal brand is doing. But don't build the personal brand around a hypothetical that you haven't achieved yet. You need to build it off of who you are today and the way you're going to be that person versus building it off of the Alex in 10 years who's super organized.
Right.
So it doesn't make sense for me to try and be that now when I'm not. So having that kind of thought process when you're going through it, of being very truthful with yourself and asking for feedback from others, because sometimes you are too close to yourself to notice things. So you might think that you might not notice a really important strength or a value or something that really sticks out about you as a person and your work because it's so close to you and it's something that you do almost automatically or kind of brush off as like, oh, this, everybody does this, it's fine. So having someone so I know that I went to Zuhaili during mine and I was like, what is my strength? Like, what is my strength? And she was like, well, you're super creative. And in my brain, that wasn't a strength because in my brain, that's just my everyday workload. As I am required to be creative for my job. It's part of my job description. So I didn't really think about it as a strength until someone else was like, hey, no, not everybody can do that. That's something special to you. So there's always those things that you're going to brush off as not important that somebody else might go, hey, no, that's the thing that makes you so good of a coworker, so good of a friend, so good of a consultant because you think about this XYZ thing or you do this XYZ thing. So it's important to have those conversations as well. It may help you figure out how or where your brand wants to be or what your relationship is to who you want to be in the future.
Absolutely. And this brings us to the last part of our audit series or our audit component of the series. We know we made you think about or start making you think about some really tough questions. As we started this presentation, this part of the overall building your personal brand is the toughest and is the most important. You cannot move on to the fun part, right? Like choosing the colors, the fonts, thinking about your mission statement and like what's your vision for yourself. You cannot move to that part of the work without truly understanding who you are at your core. So please take the time to, yes, unfortunately, we do have some homework for you, but through the workbook, as Alex mentioned, please finish sections 1 and 2 before our next workshop will be on April 18th. Once you come to that next workshop, you'll have that foundational work done and you'll be able to really walk through the next section, which will be create, with that laid out of who you are at this point.
Yeah. And so mostly having this built out means that the create section is a little bit easier on you. It's a little bit easier to kind of apply different colors and font choices to your design, because as much as I would love to say, just pick whatever pretty color is the one that is the most important to you, we actually do ascribe a lot of meaning to color, and having something built out that says, this is who I am and this is how I want to show up in the world, having something that you can kind of play off of to create your branding of like who you are makes it so much easier, because creating in a vacuum based on nothing, out of nothing, is very difficult. So having a base point, a good foundation to build from, is a very important part of making sure your personal brand is very strong, but also easy.
So we're actually going to now take questions from the audience.
Actually, Zoo, can you go back to the QR code? And we'll leave that up.
Absolutely.
While we take the questions. So that the QR code, you can scan this and it will take you to the workbook. The password is audit in all caps.
Yeah.
So we have some questions.
Let's see.
Our first question is, how often should individuals revisit their personal brand audit, considering changes in the goal, industry trends, or personal development? Again, this is kind of a personal question. It's your personal brand. If you think your brand is serving you well and is working for you, you can kind of let it keep going until it doesn't. It can be sort of like signing up for a health benefit where every time you have a big life change, you go and you make a change to your personal brand.
Right.
It can be about, you can change your personal brand, or it doesn't even have to be a change. It can just be a tweak every now and again of like, oh, maybe this value has shifted. It generally changes through when your life changes. I've noticed that my personal brand has evolved and changed as I as a person and as a designer has evolved and changed. It also tends to change very greatly when I have a large life change. So when I left my corporate job to come work for Alpha, my personal brand went through a very major shift because I made such a large life choice. So there's those aspects of going through it, of being like, oh, this is the thing and this isn't working for me anymore. I need to redo it.
Right.
So checking in on your personal brand is always important. But if you find that it's still working for you, and even though your life has changed, but your personal brand still feels authentic, you don't necessarily need to change it. It's very much a personal choice of how often you want to change your personal brand. Mine changes not very often, but more often than it probably should. But I change my personal brand when my style grows or when I find it changes every couple years, but that's also the industry that I'm in, where the industry itself changes so rapidly of being in the design. So there's new creative things that go in and out as trends. So there's always that to consider as well.
I would add that personally, I don't change. Well, as I've mentioned before, I've had a pretty consistent thing that I'm working towards. So my personal brand doesn't change. So I don't necessarily leverage industry trends. And I would definitely say to try not to. Your personal brand is a foundation, right? And so you can leverage industry trends as, like, for example, if you see that in your industry, a lot more people are creating podcasts to show their expertise. You don't need to change your personal brand to fit a podcast format. You have to leverage your personal brand to fit the podcast format. And so that's how I think about trends in general. Trends is something that you leverage. You don't change who you are to fit a trend. If you have to change who you are to fit a trend, then that trend is not for you, because it will do you more damage in the future. For personal development, typically that's about the same. I don't make any personal branding changes based on how I'm bettering myself. Once I've bettered myself and I feel like I'm now a different version of who I am that does not quite fit my personal brand, then I may go back. So with all of that being said, I tend to not touch my personal brand. Probably like 3 to 5 years is when I'm really thinking or considering how many tweaks do I have to change, so on and so forth. And that typically aligns with any major career changes that I'm seeing. So that I will stay with those type of like best practices. The next question we have: what are some additional resources or books you recommend for individuals interested in deepening their understanding of personal branding?
So I actually don't have any off the top of my head. I'd have to go to my bookshelf to go look at them, and that would be sort of rude to just get up in the middle of this presentation. So I will say that there are loads of resources on the internet to help you deepen your understanding of personal branding. You are also absolutely welcome to reach out to me on LinkedIn, and I will be happy to answer any question to the best of my ability. And if you are the person who wants additional resources books, please reach out to me. I will find a list for you and share it with you on LinkedIn.
I do have, I am also more than open and happy to share any additional books. Two that do come from top of my mind is Building a Brand Story by Donald Miller. And one that I read, and I tend to always reread every other year or so, is Women of Influence by Joe Miller. Now, I have no idea if those two people are related now that I think about it.
Now that you
But
said it,
those two books really do
they are
focus on
good.
your story and focus on who you are, which again was the whole point of the audit presentation we did today. So those are two great books, but I do have a list of maybe 10 that I'm happy to share if you connect with me on LinkedIn. The next question is, how important is consistency in personal branding? Alex, I know you have many thoughts.
Consistency is important in every type of branding. I'm just going to say that right now. And consistency doesn't mean it looks exactly the same every single time you see something. It's more consistency means that you are consistently showing up in your brand. Whether that means that your LinkedIn posts all kind of follow the same voice. So you speak in the same tone every time you post something. You're not switching from super familiar and playful to very stoic and serious. You're keeping the same tonality and verb and word choices kind of consistent all the way through. It's also in ways you show up in places. So my personal brand is very colorful, it's very creative, it's got a lot of print and bright colors. It would be very odd. And when I do show up to places dressed all in black, I have been asked by multiple people, are you feeling all right? Are you okay? So it is how you show up both online, in person, how you interact. It's very important to stay consistent just across the board, because part of the reason why personal brandings are important and what they do to benefit you is it builds trust. And if you can't consistently show up, it kind of breaks that trust a little bit, because people are kind of like, oh, well, they're not consistent. So I don't really know that if they're not consistent with that, will they be consistent with me? I don't know. There's kind of this
Like back and forth.
subconscious thing that goes back and forth in a client or potential target audience's brain that kind of just goes when you see something really out of place. Also, the human brain is very good at recognizing patterns. And the more you kind of keep with the same pattern, the more people will recognize it as a you thing. And when you break out of that, people will notice. And they won't necessarily notice in a good way. It might kind of be like, ooh, that's really not on brand for them. That's kind of weird. I don't know that I want to do anything with this. So you have to be as consistent as possible. But consistency does not mean, which I think a lot of people take it to mean, doing the same thing all the time. It's just keeping within your brand voice, your brand visuals, your brand values and mission. You want to stay within that framework to build out your content to make it be as consistent as possible.
And everything you said, A+. And that's why I say, right, I don't leverage all the industry trends or all trends in general, because some trends literally will not fit your personal brand. And we all have examples of those brands that may have inserted themselves in a topic, in a event, in anything that you're just like, how does that make sense for who you are in the market, right? And that's exactly how we should see ourselves. We are walking brands. And so when you tend to leverage things or are inconsistent, you break the trust and you break the loyalty that you are building with your community or with your audience. How can you differentiate themselves or yourself effectively from competitors within their niche?
So this is where your interests and hobbies kind of play a very large role. So
Absolutely.
even if you want your brand to be completely professional and you really don't want any of your personal life reflected in your brand, like you don't want to mention family or any vacations you take or anything like that, you want it to be a very strictly professional brand, parts of your true self is always going to filter through. There's something, it may be that because, to use person A example, because he is a scuba diver and understands those rules and regulations, he might be able to do a job or a consulting job with someone who does things with scuba because he already understands those parameters. So that is a thing that sets him apart, because the other competitor might not have that background to be able to go, oh, well, I don't really understand it. So, but I can learn, versus someone going, oh, I already understand it. You don't need to teach me that. I can come in and help automatically and start right away. So those kinds of things that kind of give you a leg up don't necessarily need to be a professional skill. It could be that you speak another language. It could be that you are a very accomplished writer and you have a very good writing style and the competitor doesn't. It honestly could just be that you're a better communicator than someone and you're like, I am really good at not me personally, but I am really good at public speaking. And therefore, I can go give this presentation to your employees that
Right.
will be clear and concise versus someone who will stutter their way through it because they don't want to public speak and aren't comfortable doing so.
Right.
So you have to kind of find those little things within your own self and what little parts of your life that you might kind of overlook as like, well, my whole family speaks Spanish. I don't understand why this is so important. But if you're trying to get a consulting job where 50% of the population of the office speaks Spanish and the other 50% speaks English, having someone who can go in and be like, oh, I can communicate effectively with both sides of your population without having to bring in an interpreter or a translator, that can be a very large benefit to someone hiring you over someone who only speaks one language or the other.
Right. Right.
So there's those kinds of things to consider. It's also very important to consider just what you bring to the table in terms of any professional accreditations you have. It might just be that you're winning out over another person because you have gotten a certification in something and that other person hasn't. So there's those things to factor into your personal brand as well.
And I would just to add, personal branding, yes, is personal, but it's also personable. So meaning this is how other people connect with you, right? Majority of us, if not all of us, make decisions on who we decide to work with, who we decide to spend our free time with, who we decide to travel with based on people that we actually like. So your differentiator can really truly just be how other people connect with you, how easy it is to connect with you, how memorable the connection with you is. And so all of these things, these are not things that you have to overthink, right? Which is why we've consistently repeated through our presentation, you have to talk to your community, to your family, to your colleagues, because you don't build a personal brand in by yourself or in a day, right? You have to talk to other people so you yourself can learn how other people perceive you and how other people connect with you, because that in itself can be your differentiator in the market.
And our final question is, what if you have multiple target audiences you are trying to reach? Can this create personal brand messiness if you're trying to reach multiple markets or say many things?
So I can add, from my experience, it does not, right? So for example, on LinkedIn, I specifically talk about or share insights onto multicultural marketing. But again, I really focus on the Latino community. And so I may do that. Sometimes I've done that and talked about the Super Bowl. I've done that and talked about the buying power of Latinos. I will be talking about the influence that Latinos have in the music industry. So I'm talking about all these different industries, and maybe I can hop onto trends, but I am still within my lane. I am talking about the growth and the power and positive representation of Latinos, which is my mission and which is the content that I share on LinkedIn. And so having, when I'm trying to reach multiple target audiences, sometimes I'm trying to connect with professionals. Other times I want more executives to look at my work, and that's when I do my deep dives, my articles. I'm thinking of different ways to differentiate my content overall to expand a wider audience. But again, all of the different mediums that I use to showcase my personal brand or my interests that I'm interested in speaking about, that does not change my personal brand. If anything, it actually makes it stronger, because I make decisions every single time when I go to create content or go to share resources. Am I the right person to say this thing that I'm about to say? Does this align with the things that I've been talking about? And would the person on the other side of the computer feel like this feels right coming from Suhaili? And if at any given point one of those answers is no, then I rethink or just literally do not do the content because it does not fit my brand. And so I think when people get into the messiness of the personal brand, it really comes down to the fact that you just don't have a very clear personal brand yet. And you don't have maybe your 1 to 3 topics or things you want to be known for. And that's typically when it gets a bit messy.
And I'll speak from the visual side of it, is for visual and voice and tone for a brand, you can avoid the messiness by staying when I do it for clients, it's more the brand is your story. And your story never changes.
Right.
Maybe the part of the story that you highlight, depending on who you're talking to, changes a little bit, where instead of highlighting the beginning, you highlight the end or the middle, depending on what you're trying to accomplish in whatever interaction you're having. But a brand is part of a conversation you're having with your target audience. So it doesn't necessarily matter what your target audience is, or if it's completely different. Your target audience could be like Alpha Nationals, it could be both students and professionals. And we are constantly going back and forth with who we're speaking to, or speaking to both of them simultaneously. But Alpha is still Alpha. So it's a conversation you're having with your audience, and keeping your story the same the whole time and keeping your visual identity the same the whole time cuts down on the messiness in terms of having so many different parts flying around on one platform.
All right. I think we got through all of our questions.
Yes. So, muito obrigado for everybody. Thank you for joining us. I don't know how to say it in Spanish. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias. And we're really looking forward to welcome you all and even more on April 18th. And that is when we're going to go through the Create. Alex, I don't know if you want to give a little blurb about what that.
So for part 2, we'll be going into the 4 V's of brand development, which are voice, values, visuals, and vision. And it will kind of take everything that you did in these part today and apply it to how you can show up in a brand versus, so it'll help you. I have some resources about colors, about font choices, and all of the different ways that we subconsciously think about these things, of what associations we have to different types of fonts and colors and things like that. So there's a lot of those things that will happen in part 2. You're all going to get a small little crash course in Graphic Design 101. So I hope you're looking forward to it. So we hope to see you next time.
Yes. Please take the time to do the audit part, so then we can all come together and we can answer your questions in real time on April 18th. Thank you so much.
If you have questions in the meantime, do reach out to us on LinkedIn. We are more than happy to help.
Thank you.
Thank you.